So first, a little bit about our featured guests. Lindy Elkins-Tanton is the director of the School of Earth and Space Exploration at Arizona State University, co-chair of the Interplanetary Initiative, and she is the principal investigator of the Psyche mission, selected in 2017 as the 14th in NASA's Discovery program. Her research includes theory, observation, and experiments concerning terrestrial planetary formation, magma oceans, and subsequent planetary evolution, including magmatism and interactions between rocky planets and their atmospheres. Among her numerous publications, Elkins-Tanton is the author of a 6-book reference guide to the solar system. Jeffrey Jerome Cohen has been professor of English and director of the Institute for Medieval and Early Modern Studies at George Washington University, and is on the verge of beginning a new appointment as Dean of Humanities at Arizona State University. His research broadly examines phenomena that are paradoxically alien and intimate. Much of his current work brings to fruition a long-time engagement with the environmental humanities and ecological theory. Cohen is the author or editor of 15 books, including his recent Stone, An Ecology of the Inhuman, and the seminal work Monster Theory, Reading Culture. Let me now put this little book Earth in context. A few years ago, I founded this book series called Object Lessons. These are short books about ordinary things, from driver's licenses to dust, from silence to socks. The idea is that an author chooses an object and runs with it for about 100 pages. The books take various forms and run the gamut from ontological inquiries to personal journeys. When I first talked to Jeffrey about doing a book for us, I had no idea what he might propose. But I was a great admirer of his work on the environmental humanities, and I knew he was working on a book about rocks. I thought, maybe he'll propose a book about lichen, or I don't know, canyons. The pitch that came back surprised me. A co-authored book with Lindy, formatted in letters and other social media exchanges about Earth. What? This seemed impossibly ambitious and experimental for such a small format project. Could it be done? The final result was an utter joy to read, and it was equally delightful to teach in my environmental theory course last fall. As I look back through my copy of Earth, I noticed I'd written a brief litany on the back of the last page. Here's what I'd written: funky tension, scale, time, warped, in parentheses, tangibility. Let me try to parse this cryptic list of terms and ideas, because I didn't write anything else. Because we were talking so much, it was just a really exciting conversation that week. Okay, funky tension. The funky tension must have been a phrase offered by one of my students. Perhaps a way to describe the ambiance of this book, the way it shifts back and forth from the vastly cosmic to the deeply personal. It is an inviting tension, an open invitation to dwell in the funkiness of living on this planet, if you think about it enough. Scale. Scale is one of the book's overriding themes. Or really, scale is sort of a conceptual labyrinth that Jeffrey and Lindy wander through as they discuss the planet we call home. As one of the authors puts it, we are embodied and we compose from our lived perspective. But I'm also wondering how we widen that personal point of view to embrace objects on a scale that exceeds us, and yet guard ourselves from losing the words to narrate or the desire to connect. So as we learn to adjust our sense of scale in this book, so do we learn to see new layers of complexity and beauty and recognize our entanglements across these layers. Time, warped. This book takes shape over several years of friendship, correspondence, and intellectual camaraderie. The book also zooms us way out to the point that sometimes we are pondering the blue marble in the sky, looking down at ourselves from far away. The time that elapses over these pages is fascinatingly warped, as emails and instant messages wend their way through cyberspace, and as we travel in our minds beyond the atmosphere and out into the icy black. It's astonishing how such a little book can manage to take the reader on such a big adventure. Of course, we all know that a good book can warp time. You lose yourself in the words, sentences become alluring wormholes, and suddenly a few hours have disappeared. Tangibility. At least for me, it is precisely the material form of the book, that makes this project so special. It is itself a tangible object, even as it reflects an ephemeral, intersubjective journey, and reflects on a large object, this planet, impossibly beyond our grasp. Earth is a tangible book, something to hold and something to behold. So in anticipation of this event, I asked several of my students to join Jeffrey and Lindy on the stage. Margaret O'Connell is a philosophy and English double major here at Loyola. Maggie Bowen is an environmental studies major. Grant Dufresne is a philosophy and English double major. Dari Zeltzer is a sociology major. And Casey Dawson is an English major, straight out. These students all had lingering questions they wanted to ask the authors, and so I decided, in the spirit of this book's unique style, to organize the event as a discussion rather than as a formal lecture. Maggie's going to start things off this evening appropriately with a letter to the authors, and we'll let it go from there. We'll have this discussion for a while, as long as it takes, and then whenever it seems right, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And then copies of the book are available in the lobby, and Jeffrey and Lindy would be happy to sign them if you so desire. You can sell them on eBay to make a fortune. So I trust my students and Jeffrey and Lindy and you all to continue the conversation that is initiated so elegantly in this little book, Earth. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you all.
Dear Jeffrey and Lindy, I'm writing this letter from my friend Emily's second-story porch. That's Emily. The porch is located a mile from Loyola's campus and elevated about 20 feet off the ground, so when I look off to one side to collect my thoughts, I can see over the top of the tree crammed into the grass space between the sidewalk and the street and catch a squirrel dart across the power lines that intersect the tree. It's distracting but thought-provoking working outside. I read Earth with my environmental theory class taught by Dr. Shaberg, and we would often gather outside and have unexpected conversations provoked by the text we read, such as Earth, each other's unimpeded thoughts and questions, and our outdoor environment. The question I would like to ask everyone to begin with is actually a slight rewording of one you, Jeffrey, posed to Lindy on page 73 of Earth. How do we trigger communal widenings of perspective in the hope of a more just or at least more sustainable world?
Start with the easy questions.
First of all, it's great to be here. Thanks for coming tonight. It's very fun to have you all reading our book. Something that Jeffrey noticed and just pointed out to me this afternoon that I hadn't really noticed before is how much of this book is about leadership. And something that I learned recently about leadership, what is leadership compared to, say, management, or what is leadership compared to living a life? And the difference is having a vision. You don't need to have anybody who's following you. You don't need to be managing anybody or have a group in order to be a leader. To be a leader, what you need is to have a vision and then share that vision with others. And I don't think I'd realized before that that is a theme that goes all through the book. Is that something you want to spring off from?
Well, it is interesting that you would pick up on that because, Lindy and I are both, Lindy is already at ASU, I'm moving there, and one of the catalyst behind it was actually writing this book and thinking about at what scale, maybe some of the vision that I have for the humanities and what they could be, a vision that I've worked out through my collaboration and friendship with Lindy, how that could be implemented through the resources that ASU offers. But it also, another attraction of this, and maybe this gets at the heart of what you asked about, ways to bring out a more just world, is that for me, writing this book, relocating to ASU, experiencing deeply and profoundly what it's like to be at an ambitious public university that is really student-centered and dedicated on giving the best education possible to those who come in through the doors, something I actually believe is very true of this university as well. I've sat through the classes, I've seen it in action. It's surprisingly rare in higher ed. There are many universities so enamored of their Research 1 status that really what they focus on is research product rather than how to come up with shared collaborative knowledge, how to equip the students who move through classrooms to actually do that work of changing the world. And I've loved that this book has spurred a conversation that is student-centered. And Lindy and I were talking about this. We didn't really want to give some kind of lecture. What we have loved is the ability to interact with you, and we find that very, very gratifying. And the one little tiny side note that I will say is I sometimes get a little bit despondent. I feel like many of the people in my generation either gave up or lost an opportunity. Whenever I feel despair, I go into my undergraduate classroom and I talk to them about their vision for the future, and then I feel affirmed. I truly believe there's a generation moving through right now that is going to take our nation to the place where it needs to be and should have gone long ago. Yeah.
Thanks for giving such thoughtful answers. And I think we talked in Dr. Eklund's class, and we read chapter 5 of Earth for that class, and a lot of students brought up the question that you guys bounced around of does beauty impede or enable? And I think a struggle that a lot of environmentalists deal with is trying to move people to action, or inspiration. And probably, anyone, teachers, definitely with their students, and what is that thing that motivates? And I'm trying to find the quote of, and Lindy, you say that in a broad sense, beauty is, I don't even know if I have a song. Yeah, I do. Is the reason we all do what we do, why we choose the field we choose, and what gives us the determination to keep working in the face of discouragements. And whether that's post-grad or while we're studying, if we can, we have to choose one, if we're stuck in one path, and if that's not still inspiring us, but if we can continue to be inspired by other things and inspire other people, how do you suggest creating spaces for that to happen? If you guys or any of you guys want to answer that, if I can pass the microphone around too. And I'm terrible at talking into the microphone, sorry.
Do you want to say something first?
I think you should start because that seemed really addressed to you.
Yeah.
And it's easy.
And it's so easy. It's something that none of us struggle with. I think I do really think that, and not necessarily beauty in a classical sense, or that Tolstoy would have said that beauty is the incarnation of the divine. But I think there's something about beauty that we feel in our guts, almost like a sense of rightness, or a sense of perfection, or a sense of inspiration. It's that kind of beauty that I'm talking about when I think that's why people do the things that we do. I think that's what inspires us to move on and be our better selves. And a struggle that I've had in my life is that I've been constantly searching for the place where I felt like I could be effective and have those feelings and be working on something that inspired me. And I think, in retrospect, I think part of it was being a woman in science in a very, very male-dominated field, not always, sometimes just feeling the implicit bias, feeling the stereotype threat, and having that kind of eat away a little bit of the beauty that I was feeling inside of me, and always looking for, in the end, the community of people around me who also felt that sense of beauty and who were inspiring to me. And so I've had such a funny, windy path for someone who's ended up where I am right now. And so if it's helpful, I would offer that you shouldn't be afraid of that, and that you should keep seeking that thing which speaks to you. And if you change what you're doing and move from one thing to another, that doesn't mean that you're flighty. It means that you're moving forward. And what I hope is that, as to combine your two kinds of questions. What I hope is that all of us are constantly working to make the culture, the community, and the vision that we see for the world in our everyday lives. Because I don't think that activism of a kind that is aggressive, attacking, can be really effective in the end, because it's very off-putting for the people who might not have felt that they've joined yet. I think that we've got to make something that can be inclusive, that can be taken in small steps, that can be seen as a positive place for everyone to end up. And so that's what I've ended up with for myself at this moment in my life, although I don't think there's ever a moment when I think I've grown up and been done. But that's what I'm working on now.
I remember a powerful moment when, in the wake of some of the hate crimes that had happened post-election, I wanted to try to mobilize some academics to find a way to react and envision a better world than the one that was unfolding. And when I had come up with a formulation about something like, scholars and activists against hate, you asked me, does it really make sense to formulate an identity around what you're against, or isn't it more important to ask, what are you for? And to use that as the way forward. And that struck me as a powerful way of reconceptualizing where we put our energy, to ask, what is it that you want to affirm? What kind of world do you want to create? What kind of earth do you want to inhabit?
I think that's more powerful. If I would just add one more thing, but I would really love to hear what the rest of you think about that question. Also, it's a really profound question. But this might seem like a real sideline, but I think it's central. I wonder how many people here have ever heard of or read the book Don't Shoot the Dog? Nobody? Nobody here? So as someone who spent a lot of time training dogs and horses, working with dogs and horses, a lot of training methods are really negative, or they're based on physical force. They're based on correcting the thing that's wrong instead of encouraging the thing that's right. And this is a training method which is basically all around affirming the moment that the creature you're trying to influence is making the positive choice, and you affirm right at that moment. And you can use this technique to train anyone, including your roommate, by rewarding and thanking at those positive moments. And then what you end up with is, rather than the kind of off-puttingness that you get, for example, after a critique of your work, when you're like, oh God, I feel terrible about this, it's much worse than what I thought, I don't know if I want to go back and fix it now. Instead, what you find is you feel energized and you want to continue the collaboration further. And so it's a little metaphor for how I think life is better when you're trying to influence other creatures that way.
It makes me want to reread our book and see if I was being trained somehow as part of it.
Well, all those little chocolate caramels, right at that,
That's good, Jeffrey.
What do you all think about this question?
I have the microphone, I guess, so I'll talk. It's weird to talk at you into a microphone, but you're right next to me. And it's for everyone. And I have a bad habit when I'm nervous of talking myself into sentences I can't get myself out of, so we'll see what happens. But we'll see where it goes from here. So with regards to Maggie's question about how we kind of move ourselves towards something and towards justice, you talk about beauty in the book, but I think at one point you even say that beauty moves us, but not often collectively. It doesn't move us towards collective action, and it makes me think about we also read Staying with the Trouble by Donna Haraway, which was a wild ride. But I really, really liked it, really enjoyed it, and she talks a lot about kind of like overlapping subjectivities and just entangling and not only working with other people and other things, but becoming with them, and it just makes me wonder, and I really liked the idea of entanglement that she proposes and just kind of engaging with things, but I wonder if it's enough to just entangle or if you ever have to reach some solution. I tend towards sometimes feeling that there is no one solution, but I don't necessarily know how productive that mindset is.
Could I respond?
Yes.
Great question, Dari. We should write letters back and forth sometime.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to just adjunct, like, piggyback onto Dari's question before you guys answer it. As far as like entanglements go, Jeffrey, yes. I think this goes along with how you talk about like disembodied perspective, how like that's just not an option. You can't like view something that you can't like not be a part of it, you know? We can't pretend like we're not a participating member of the earth. And I think that like definitely goes along with Donna Haraway's ideas that she put forth, and like every interaction that we have, no matter like how closed off we are. So, and yeah, and I think that like even if we want like a clear-cut solution to something, the way to get that is by just like allowing entanglements. And I did for another class a study about the Kayapo resistance and how like them being an indigenous people and living off the land 100%, they had so much more to say about the environmentalist movement because they really had like the most knowledge about the damaging effects. And like at the end of the day, we can just like step back and have like all of this stuff ready made for us and not be completely engaged or entangled in it. So I feel like that might be a good like starting point for how an example of someone who is completely entangled in their environment versus us who are very much isolated from it. So, yeah.
Can I say something to that quickly? So I was thinking about this a little bit in that right before we came here, we went upstairs and we went to the greenhouse and we had a view on New Orleans that's actually pretty hard to get, one in which you're up looking down and all of New Orleans kind of arranges itself around you. You can see how green it is, you can see the canopy, the woodlands. And I was thinking a little bit about some of the writing that happened post-Katrina about New Orleans, where it was pointed out that one possible perspective on the flooded city was that the one that our president got when he flew over it in an airplane, looked down, but didn't come down and didn't get that more entangled version. It seems like, you know, you can survey the land and say, oh, here's what the flood did, isn't it terrible? But you won't understand the stories of how unevenly the suffering was distributed, exactly who lost their homes, how recovery was going to be so much more difficult. I mean, this seems to me to argue very forcefully for the kind of entangled staying with the trouble knowledge that Donna Haraway writes about. She condemns this idea of the God trick, where you think that you can abstract yourself from the situation, look down and understand it. And the one other thing I'll say related to it, it's not that Lindy and I did this as an intentional strategy, but one of the things that we liked about sending letters back and forth that were real letters is that they got at the sort of everyday embodied things that we do, from enjoying coffee in the morning and Prosecco at night to, you know, like the little pleasures that fuel the writing. But even Lindy's decision to talk about cancer as part of the narrative, to enter that in. And those seem to me very important moments of articulating embodied stakes of what's going on, why it matters, to keep the scale both human and then also vaster as we move along.
Yeah, just really quick, something that makes me think about, that I think about a lot, is how I feel like as a kid you're told like, oh, you're not the center of the universe, but to you, you are. You really can't see anything from any other way.
Yep.
This side, we haven't heard a lot about vision, leadership, beauty.
Yeah, I have also been thinking a lot about this, and in one of our philosophy classes, we read Sartre's theory of like non-ecological consciousness, and the way that consciousness like is in the world around us, and kind of is different theories about consciousness as extended body, and Today I had an allergic reaction to fire ants. I'm very allergic to them. And I was thinking about like our planet as a body kind of, and the allergic reaction that it's having to like us basically, in the way that we were here. We're in it already, but we're affecting it in a way, and it's responding like in the ozone and other ways to us dangerously. And I guess I was just kind of thinking about what you guys, sorry, I'm like so nervous, about what you guys discuss in terms of scale and in terms of like putting anti-itch cream on or like a steroid shot, and like how we can kind of take care of this reaction that the earth is having to us in ways that are small or larger. And in terms of what we were discussing about beauty, the way that like the sublime and like the terror, and sometimes gorgeous terror of like those walls of trash, and like just certain things can be so terrifyingly beautiful. And just kind of how, sorry, I have a lot. And just kind of how that role of scale and that understanding of seeing a picture across the world of this like global difference can affect an individual and invoke individual action in a different place. I guess, does that make sense? I'm sorry.
You've got a lot of really rich ideas in there, and something that brought together two ideas in my mind that I hadn't had before, which is the inverse relationship between scale and pain. I think that it's a luxury of both wealth and time and health to be able to step so far back from a problem that you could imagine seeing it from a great distance. You're in a helicopter over the city, or you're in your dreams, you're in space looking back at the planet and meditating on the beauties of it, or even the sort of intellectual distance that we are all having on this problem right now. But then, when the body is in pain, for example, with you and your reaction today, it brings you very, very much tighter into your body. You know, right at that moment, you're living between you and the pain in your arm, or you and your anaphylactic shock, or if you're in tremendous pain, you're just sort of living inside your body, taking a breath at a time, and you don't have the luxury to step outside and think about things in terms of scale. And it made me think, as you were speaking, that there's a tipping point where you could have the luxury of thinking about the planet as a whole, and for example, climate change isn't really affecting me personally yet, say a lot of people who don't know better. and it's something you can talk about philosophically, and there's a point at which it begins to become personal, but you're still at a point where you've got enough luxury and wealth and thought that you can take action. But then at some point, it's going to become a pain so intense that you're only dealing with yourself and your family, or yourself and your house, like it was during the floods here, for example. And I wonder, as everyone on Earth is somewhere on that scale between the personal, my house is being flooded, I'm losing my livelihood, or I don't feel the effects yet. What I'm hoping is that we all come to that tipping point where we realize we need to take action, we can do things now while we still have the luxury to do that we don't all get slid right down to the pain end of that scale too quickly. And that's the image in my mind that came up while you were speaking.
Yeah, Lindy, I think what you just pointed at, talking about the pain end of that scale, the other end of it, or somewhere maybe a little bit above the middle, is the desire to aestheticize and fetishize disaster. Sometimes it seems like, oh, well, nobody wants to talk about death and destruction, but it turns out we do all the time, and we want to see it, but we also want it to exit for the next thing that we can consume.
We don't want it to be right by us. We want to watch it.
Yeah, and then once we're over that, maybe sick of it, once the effects of the tragedy porn have worn off, we may as well move on. And I think, especially with Jeffrey, one of the letters you write was on the 10th anniversary of Katrina, pretty close to the beginning of the book. Mm-hmm. And it's like, having gone through that, and I'm certain a number of people in the room did, it's so hard to make that shift, like not just from the pain up, but to have people come from that fetishization or that, oh, I remember that, that's a thing that happened, right? Down. And the meeting in the middle, how do we envision that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To borrow a phrase from biology, this concept of punctuated equilibrium, which is really about extinctions, but it's also about the small-scale extinctions like the crises we're talking about. We can look at this terrible thing from a distance, but then we imagine that everything just returns to equilibrium how it was. So can we come to that point where we realize that the equilibrium has shifted without falling into such a panic that we're down at one end of the scale where we can't act anymore?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I would also say related to that is the kind of helplessness that we can feel when we first realize disaster is coming on, as if there's no way to put a brake on it, as if there's no way to save anyone besides your own family, to try to come up with more capacious ways of creating refuge for others. Right now, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, I'm working on a project on Noah's Ark, and one of the unfortunate after effects of the Noah's Ark myth, which is still the way we tend to narrate climate change involving water, which is to say most climate change at this moment, is to sort of repeat Noah's acquiescence to God. When God says, build an ark, a flood is coming, Noah doesn't argue at all. And there have been other times in other cultures that have taken Noah severely to task for not arguing with God. There are good models elsewhere in the Bible. Cain, Abraham, Moses, they all argue with God and get concessions. It seems to be a God who likes to be argued with. He likes the back and the forth. But Moses is told to build the ark, and he builds the ark, and the only people saved are his own family. And we could wonder if that is something that is worth replicating, or is maybe it's a limited model that we need to get beyond. The flood doesn't have to come, and we don't have to lose as many people as we resign ourselves to losing.
If I could respond to that. I might not need it. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
What about the recording, though? I think maybe it doesn't. It doesn't get recorded if you don't have it mic'd.
Okay, so along with this kind of fits into your the Noah myth and the idea of like how not to like fetishize disaster, or along with like we're not really fetishizing disaster, but contemplating the really difficult and unsavory ideas like climate change and global warming, and simpler things like more personal things. On 94, I'm not sure who's speaking here. I think this is Jeffrey. And all of this because you thought you could escape Earth and grapple with more distant things. And this kind of reminds me of like the, and I keep thinking about how the verb grasp means to hold something tight as well as to apprehend. And you mentioned yesterday about, or Thursday about your tiny oncology mode of teaching, and and I just think that that's super useful. The idea of some things, just some thoughts you can't really scale up. Some interactions just you can't have on a grand scale, and you have to like have conversations and interactions that are really tiny to fully understand, to apprehend, because you can't grasp the earth and those concepts. You have to just like have this tiny little microcosm, and then it'll maybe, but if I could get your guys's, if you guys want to provide your thoughts on that.
So the Tiny Ecology project is something I work into almost every environmental course that I teach, where students find a neglected space in their life that they walk by every single day and start to pay attention with it. 5 to 10 minutes every single day, writing in a notebook whatever they want, a sketch, a poem, a song, whatever. And this tiny ecology can be anything from, say, a pot of succulents that's just sitting, to one student chose mold that's growing on his shower in his dorm. And it almost becomes a contest to pick the thing that has nothing to say about it. And yet they find, by spending so much time with it, this tiny ecology and the sustained attentiveness that they bring to it, and the relationship that they build to the tiny portion of the world opens up into all kinds of greater understandings about how the world works or not. And what I know I told this story in class, but one of my favorite things about the meditation on mold on a shower curtain is that it became a meditation as well on labor in Washington, D.C., and especially invisible labor, who was cleaning that dorm room, and race and labor, and then race and ecology, and the segregation of the city itself. And all of that came from observing mold, but then thinking about how that ecology is much bigger than it seems to be. So yeah. Well, right, so thank you for the invitation to expand on that. But this is something I'm passionate about because I feel like sustained attentiveness is not something that we're well rewarded for now. Our attention goes everywhere, and we forget the pleasure of actually being with something for a long time.
To kind of comment on your comment about our attention being everywhere, I was thinking a lot about the Noah's Ark kind of idea that you were expanding on, and how popular apocalypse is, and pessimism, and thinking about it. And it seems that it's almost becoming like a self-sustained, like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? But I also, with all of our attention being drawn with media on the bad that happens, whether it be in movies, apocalypse, or things that are constantly happening, like wars that we can see on the news, we can see people dying, and floods and environmental disasters. It seems that it's so easy to think about the next thing that happens as it happens, instead of what we can do now to kind of prevent those things. And I was just wondering, like, how do you guys think that we can kind of approach this in a way that's more humanizing? Because I think, like you were saying, with the scale, that when we see something kind of from a less human perspective, whether it be on the news or maybe above the city that's flooded, it's hard to make those connections, like you pointed out, to humans and people who are suffering through that. But it also seems like it's so easy to forget with all the different things that happen. Even people who have lived through Katrina don't really think about how their actions affect the environment and how that's going to affect them in the future and how it will affect what happens. So I know there's a lot of ideas that were just like thrown out.
This really resonates for me. Is that okay if I say something about this? No, I'm good. I'm mic'd up. But this just connects so strongly to things that are really on my mind right now. For maybe 15 years now, with my son, who's now just turned 26, and last week, and my husband, we've been talking about how you figure out a vision for your life. What is it? How can you make a difference that matters? What would that difference be? And the things that you just brought up are at the heart of the things that I've come to decide. It took me a really long time to figure out. How many of you have all had somebody say, what's your goal in life? What are you going to be doing? What do you want in 5 years? And I always hated that question because I didn't have an answer, and that made me feel insufficient. But it just took me a long time to think of a vision that I thought was worthwhile. And the vision that I have now is I want to try to use everything that I have to create a critical mass of people in society who recognize problems as being unsolved and feel that they have the agency and the resilience to try to solve those problems. And that ties very closely with exactly what you're talking about. It's something that I actually say to the school where I'm director and to the teams. I think that pessimism and cynicism are just lazy. And there's really not much positive to be said about them, and they're a refuge for people who do feel like they don't have the agency to make change. And so it's very easy to just then become a cynic. But it's absolutely lazy, and it's absolutely unforgivable, and we can't afford it. You have to be an optimist, and you have to take action. And the other part of this that I really wanted to bring up in response to what you said is, I realized, so I'm now 52, and I realized when I was about 45, suddenly, that the reason that a lot of adults, like all of us here today, complain about things is because it actually never occurred to us that we could change it. And education is partly at fault here. You know, our educational system was invented by the Prussians, and it was designed to make a compliant industrial workforce. And in my opinion, in the average American education, you reach a low of creativity in high school, because the way to succeed in high school is to have a blind acceptance of the content that's given you and to regurgitate it back onto standardized tests. And the way to not succeed in high school is to think way out of the box, ask lots of questions that your teacher doesn't know the answer to, and rush off doing projects that are not related to, you know, your multiple choice test. I mean, really, it is teaching a kind of passive compliance. And so I think that the best thing that we can do is, it's a little easier to make this change in university, and I trust and see that you all are doing it here, and then drive it to high school. Teach people that almost all problems are unsolved and that all of us can take an action. And that, I think, is a way forward for the things that you're mentioning. And it's at the heart of the things that I care about the most. So forgive me for that little monologue, but I think it's
everyone
critical.
to note, on April 20th, 2018, Lindy Elkins-Tanton fomented the revolution. This is where things change.
I'm so happy that my plan is working and we're circling back to the first question, kind of.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Well, and
big question.
can I add something to that? Only because I truly believe in this too, and I think one of the reasons why Lindy and I have such a good friendship and collaboration is that we just do not have time for cynicism, for hate, for people telling us why things won't work. We just feel like that gets in the way, and unfortunately, it's not just high school. It seems to be even built into the structure of many universities and colleges, and it leads to...
How do you recover from that? If you've been taught that for 8 years straight, how do you recover? Sorry, go ahead.
And yet, right, and yet we see people who could have become victims of such a system or could have found the easier way of just complaining all the time, chose not to.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I remember when I first came to Loyola, I was like, I can read things and think about them and like not feel so dumb all the time because I can't remember what year something happened or like certain just rote memorization. But to kind of go off what Grant was saying was he was discussing this advocacy for change and like humanizing it and kind of understanding the effects of ourselves on ourselves. But I guess I'm just wondering if you guys think that it's necessary to kind of like that kind of anthropocentrism is necessary to invoke change, to say this is how it's affecting you, and this is rather than this is how it's affecting us, a plant or the ocean or different things. And if it's not necessary, how you can still advocate this message to people who might want the kind of anthropocentric argument.
Great question.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of the moment in the book where I'm getting all hyped up about people not doing what they need to do to prevent the onslaught of catastrophe that's coming. And I think I write, maybe it's in one of the text exchanges, or it's something like, and if we don't act now, all life is going to be wiped out. And you very mildly write back and say, human life will be wiped out, but the earth will be fine.
Fine. There will be life on Earth. The planet is fine. It's just that we will lose the quality of life that we've become accustomed to.
Maybe derailing a little bit, but I'm not really. So yeah, so reading, like this conversation, and reading, like Donna Haraway especially, but also Humankind, by Timothy Morton, have got me thinking about like anthropocentrism a lot, and our relationship to the world around us, and not just our effects on things, but things' relations to each other that have nothing to do with us. And one of the reading this book, one of the things that I really just stopped and was like, oh my God, was when I think it was Jeffrey, you point out that the number 10 is not mathematically natural. It's just the number of fingers that we have. And so that doesn't, to me, that was just indicating just how incredibly ingrained this anthropocentrism is, how it's embedded in the ways that we learn and all of the knowledge that we have in many ways. And I wonder how we can unlearn things like that. When I think the number 10, I'm like, that's a nice, even, pleasant number, because apparently it just corresponds to my fingers. But how do we unlearn things like that? And how can unlearning things like that change our relationship to the earth and to the rocks and plants around us?
I wonder if it's
possible. A lot of this
possible.
goes back to what Lindy was saying earlier. It's about asking questions and asking the kinds of questions that can help you to come at something afresh. They can be observation-based ones. So what does it mean that we suddenly have a system of mathematics that winds up being quietly for and about humans, and yet we know there's more to math than that. That's not the limitations of it. So what interesting questions can we ask about it? What questions will give us traction for new kinds of thinking? I'm convinced that part of the solution to any problem is to inhabit a beginner's mind, have some wonder about it, ask something big, but then get into the conversation that helps you to refine it into something small and practical, and we'll find your way in. It seemed like so much of the book we wrote was about scale shifting. So the big and the small had to go hand in hand as you keep zooming in between each.
I do think questions are the key to it all, and we've been developing a way of learning and a way to work in teams and problem solve that's based entirely around questions. In fact, we have a little tech startup called Beagle Learning that it's an online platform for kind of asking your questions and laying out all your answers into sort of a mind map so you see where you're going. And the thing that we've come to, we're doing some actually original research on sociology and linguistics, and I can't even believe I get to do this, it's so fun. I think all of us become pretty darn good at asking questions about the content that's right in front of us and the thing we're trying to understand this moment. And if you're familiar with the famous Bloom's taxonomy of the steps of learning that was developed in the 1950s, that applies beautifully to the kinds of questions you ask about something you're trying to learn more and more about. But the thing that I think we need is we need to understand how to ask questions that will take us beyond this piece of content to something that is a much bigger goal that will take us 10 steps to get there, and we have to learn many different pieces of content and continue to enhance our understanding to the point where we can answer that big question. And so we've created this paradigm we call the natural next question. So you finished reading, say, this fabulous book called Earth, and now you realize that your big question is really, how could I create a larger movement of people who are going to undertake some action? And that's your big goal out there. So then your natural next question is the question that you ask that takes you one step further away from what you've just read and toward your bigger goal. And we're figuring out how to actually measure the efficacy of those questions, because I think those are the questions that we as humans need to learn how to ask, is the question that takes you one step closer to a bigger, more audacious problem.
Going off of that, one thing that I enjoyed in the book was the discussion of technology's enhancement of imagination. And I was just kind of thinking about like you were saying, the media, the content that we consume and look at, just that's right in front of us, but how we can use technology as this means of understanding the world and communicating information that's not isolating the technological world from the world around us, I guess. So I was just wondering how you think we can use technology to like further this cause in a way that isn't creating a kind of binary between tech and...
Interesting.
The one thing we argue for in the book is that we need to expand our idea of what we include under technology. For example, I think, especially as a humanities scholar, narrative is one of the most important technologies. It's the ultimate device for zooming in and out and getting comprehension as part of it. It can make people think and it can make people feel. I mean, there are all kinds of technologies that we use that aren't hard technologies that we don't create necessarily in a lab, but they're devices, including linguistic ones, that we rely on every day. And we could think about, are they being effective? Are they distracting us? Do we want to both think and feel in a certain way? Or how do we get some distance on that? So, I don't know, it's hard to divorce things like how to know with how to disseminate that knowledge. They come together so intimately with each other.
When you all are apprehending the natural world via some technology, can you think of times when it made the natural world feel more real and intimate, and other times when it made it seem more distant and imaginary? So how do we have it always be the first thing?
I think that is an interesting question coming from a planetary scientist, because I would never see a picture of space without, a really high-powered telescope. So the closest I would get to some natural world is like just on Earth and the ocean, which I guess is part of Earth. So any like planetary things, so technology and space.
That was a mic drop moment right there. Yeah.
I knew it was there.
Maybe now we can open it up a little bit.
There, totally.
That was a good.
Yeah.
One of the mics so that we can record it. The camera's going to stay on the folks, but please, any questions, feel free to come down with questions or comments.
If you all don't have questions, we're going to start asking.
Yep.
Yes, roam the audience, asking questions at random.
So we kind of talked about this in Dr. Eichmann's class with you, Jeffrey, but this was just about how you think it affected the book by you being a woman in the STEM field instead of a man being in the STEM field. So we kind of like talked about it in his class, how like in humanities you're able to get kind of like emotional and like very personal with your life, but the STEM major, it's more like objective thinking and that type of thing. Yeah, and so I was just wondering how you think that gender kind of affected the way this book turned out, especially with you being the STEM major, not humanities.
That's interesting because I guess we wrote about it like in the introduction, how it is that we first met, and then we did this plenary conversation. There were like 600 people there. It was a big.
6,000.
There were 60,000. There were uncountable boards of people trying to listen to us speak. And I remember I thought I would ask the simple question just to get the conversation going. So what's the big question you're trying to answer with your work? Jeffrey, and everyone in the audience goes, oh, because apparently you don't ask that question of a philosopher or a medieval, or a humanist, where you're like asking questions, not so much solving them. And then you said, well, what's the role of beauty in your work? And had there been any scientists there, they would have gone, oh, but they didn't. So that is a thing. That is a thing. We're kind of taught that our emotions are not just irrelevant to the work that we're doing, but possibly destructive to it also. You're meant to be utterly objective, especially, imagine if you're a primatologist or an anthropologist and you're trying to learn something objective. You can't be completely emotionally tied up with the things that you're studying, but luckily, I realized that that doesn't really pertain to studying planets. I can emotionally connect to the planets as much as I want, and that's not going to change how they are. But another wonderful thing has happened in my career, and that is that I've now reached a point where I really am not vulnerable anymore so much to the criticisms of my peers, and so I can be exactly how I think I should be, and I think that I exercised this in this book also, just by being absolutely as transparently myself as I could. One thing I realized as I gained leadership positions was that I didn't have to be more serious, or stop wearing sparkle nail polish, or not think that laughing was a good idea in order to seem more respectable and like more in charge. I realized that the only thing that really helped was to be truly genuinely myself, and so I've extended kind of the work that we did in this book around being genuine to the notion that in a lot of places, although I don't sense it here, there's a bad culture in academia where, as professors become more senior, they use their power to self-aggrandize and sometimes to damage junior people rather than to help junior people. And so I think culture change is incredibly important in academia for inclusion, for diversity, and also for interdisciplinary work, because if you're afraid of your colleague, you'll never ask the naive question that'll lead you to a new place. And so we work on culture all the time in my school at ASU, and we talk about it. And to my total shock and surprise, I was recently invited to Stanford to talk about culture because they're trying to work on their culture. And this all ties back to the way we had this conversation in this book, because all the work that we do is personal. All the work that we do is on this human micro front, and that we should expand that so that when we're working in larger groups, we have that same realness and intimacy and sense of optimism as we have in our microcosms.
And I don't know if this surprised you in the class, and I'm not even sure, Lindy, you and I have ever talked about it, but one of the things I spoke about in the class is being important for me in writing that book, as far as the gender dynamics of the book, is to give, we live in a time when you mentioned Stanford. Stanford infamously just had a conference of historians called Practical History, at which 30 white men came together and discovered that practical history is maybe something that they should have invited some other people to talk about as well.
What was the hashtag for that?
There were a lot of hashtags, including Stanford Sausage Fest.
That's it. That's the one.
But the fact that this can still be done at this moment, men explaining things. Yeah, let's get 30 of them in the room. But there is a lesson that has not yet been learned, I think, by lots of guys who are academics, about attending to other people, listening, taking them seriously, finding that when there's an exchange rather than the impulse to explain things, you'll learn a lot more. So it was important for me, especially because one of the things I do is to train young men and women to be investigators, to have curious minds, is to maybe put some different scripts into the world for how to respectfully listen, put yourself out there, but don't make it about yourself. Try to do something that's collaborative and offer that as a model, because for me, that's the only kind of work I want to do. I don't really care about my own stuff. I want to do stuff with other people And I think I only realized in retrospect how important it was to have a different model out there, especially at a time when we've seen it go wrong. Unfortunately, I think about this a lot, where I even see people that went to graduate school at the same time as me turn out to be that guy. You know, I just wish that wouldn't happen.
But I mean, also, a point I make all the time is it's not always gendered. Everybody can splain, and so it'd be good if we just watch ourselves. And just to bring up a kind of an obvious topic that might follow this one is the topic of harassment, and something that I work on very actively all the time. And personally, I don't think that this is best solved by having the women go over there and talk about it and the men go over there and talk about it. It's much better if we talk about these things all together, because this is not always an issue of gender. You know, it's a power dynamic, and there are many, many reasons why a person's voice might not be heard that have nothing to do with their visible outside attributes. And so if we could work on a culture where each of us might hold ourselves accountable for our behavior and our neighbors together collectively, that's my goal.
And I would say related to that too is maybe a culture where instead of immediately rushing in to say things, we listen for a few minutes, we pause, we let there be an empty space where things could happen. And that's one of the reasons I love sending letters back and forth, because that enforces pause. You have to stop, listen, digest.
I don't believe in pausing. That's right, that was good with the letter.
Our tech people just said that your mics might go out. It's if all of a sudden you're not hearing anything, use the handheld mic.
Why? Why would that happen?
I have no idea. Harmonic convergence, who knows?
Okay.
So there's a couple of
criticism.
many areas where people have preconceptions of the differences between the humanities and arts and the sciences, or at least approaching problems or questions from those different perspectives. One is that the humanities and arts is a people business, and the sciences aren't. And I don't think that's true at all. I think the sciences are, you don't see one person writing a paper in the sciences ever. But the other is that the humanities and arts are all about creativity, and science is all about control. And I would say that's not true either. It's just when you're collecting your data, you should have some procedure that you're using that's consistent. So can you speak to, the approaches of all these different ways of knowing or of finding or describing, and those stereotypes?
Of course, I have a billion things to say about that, but surely one of you all might have something to add there.
Yeah, this is just something I was thinking about earlier when you were talking about the role, where you said you asked about the role of beauty in your work, and everyone would have been shocked. And like something we go over when in like our most basic like sociology classes is value-free sociology. But it was interesting to me in learning about that value-free sociology doesn't mean none of your opinions matter, or none of the things you think or you care about matter. It just means the only thing that directs is what your questions are, not how you answer them so much. Or they can, I mean, obviously in like your design of your experiment or whatever, but not in like what the answers end up being.
Sorry.
Yeah, to that question, you mentioned that in the sciences, you're pretty much never going to find a paper that's, one author, one scholar, one scientist, etc. But I think this question kind of harkens back to a point that you made earlier, Lindy, about how we ingrain in high school students, and even I see it with my own younger sibling in the middle school and grammar school levels, the desire to separate in order to focus but on the wrong things, and to compartmentalize. And the human brain in so many ways craves organization and craves understanding, But what about when we come to the wrong understanding? And what about collaboration makes us think that there ought to be an opposite? What makes us think that that shouldn't just be the way that it is?
I think having more voices helps you temper the place that you go to if you think of it all by yourself. I do think, first of all, just a little bit of a myth. I have several single-authored papers. I know lots and lots of scientists who have single-authored papers. It's good to show that you have some ideas that are just your own, because when you're with many people working together, it's never really clear where the ideas nucleate from. And so I think it's certainly rarer than in humanities, but not unheard of. As someone who's trained lots of young scientists, I would say that there are three really common misconceptions. One is that you don't have to be creative to be a scientist, which is really, really wrong. It's as wrong as it is to be in any other field. In any field of arts or humanities, you have to be very creative, and that's recognized. It's as true as that. Because it's not that you measure things and then suddenly the world speaks to you and you know the answer. You have to imagine what could be happening, and you have to make up scenarios and be super creative in thinking outside of your own natural stereotypes and misconceptions about how the world works in order to think of a way that could explain the things that you're seeing. So there's a huge amount of creativity that goes into it. And then the next one is young scientists come in and they think that they don't have to be writers. But as we all know, that the writing is the way to communicate, and you have to be able to speak, and you have to be able to draw. You have to be able to do all those things to be a scientist. And people are like, no, you mean my paper? What about this grammar? I don't, so that's disappointing to some people. And then the next thing is that, the final thing is that, because I've spent a lot of my career as a terrestrial geologist, people come in and then they realize that they don't actually want to be a scientist, they just want to go hiking. so I think that these are all just stereotypes we have about each other, and that fundamentally, as humans, we're all just trying to investigate our universe in really similar ways.
Yeah, I just want to add also, I think a lot of the times science is thought of as being completely, like you were saying, completely separate from the humanities. But people don't talk about as much the idea that the humanities is completely separate from science, which is obviously clearly untrue. And just kind of, I like to think about the way that like communication and language, like you were saying, is an equation in itself by like putting these words together and reaching this new conclusion that requires a creative surpassing of like the words that you're using. And so I think it's really cool to think about the humanities as a science and as mathematical. I don't know.
Might I add briefly that a beautiful example of this was the geologist Lyell, who was one of the people who first really convincingly laid out arguments based on observations for the length of time that the Earth must have existed, and what he wrote he wrote 2 big volumes trying to explain this in the kind of language that would be compelling and exciting to just any regular person on the street. And they were read by Darwin while Darwin was going around on the Beagle, and completely informed his idea of evolution. He could never have come to that conclusion had Lyell not been a tremendous popular writer, had he not been able to explain the science that he was thinking about in a way that someone who didn't study that would be compelled. Writing is everything.
I was thinking about this recently too when I had the privilege to reteach Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, now 53 years old, and in some ways a book of popular writing and science that has never been surpassed. It took her being a trained scientist. She was trained as a marine biologist, but also being a beautiful writer who knew how to engage her audience and made them know how to know. She could explain the chemical equations. She could tell them how pesticides were seeping in everywhere, but also taught them how to feel differently. And that, because of that book, certain pesticides got banned, the EPA got established, a president read it, and he thought, now it's time to protect the environment. And I think if we could go back to the kind of artistry that will simultaneously change hearts and minds, we'd be a lot better off. Rachel Carson knew that a long time ago, but we seem to have forgotten it.
Teaching people how to feel. That's beautiful.
So, it seems like two major themes of this discussion have been this concept of scale and like finding these little microcosms of our universe, and then also, and like the relationships between us and like the space between us and between varying sizes of concepts and things. And then also this idea of entanglement and interconnectivity. And so my question is, how do we find that balance between total connectivity and like the oneness of the universe, if you will, and our own self-awareness that is necessary for us to really know our place and how we fit into the one, kind of.
Oh, that's like asking for the answer to everything.
My follow-up is, or do you think that they are not mutually exclusive and you can be aware and also be one?
Who has the answer? I know that someone on the stage has the answer to this.
I can't share it.
You are not ready, grasshopper.
That's a hard one. I mean, isn't that why we have science and the humanities? Right? We're trying to solve how to simultaneously be able to shift to these different perspectives, how to hold them with us. And, maybe part of the issue is that we think that we can permanently be in one state, when of course we can't. We can't reconcile everything, and we keep moving and changing. And
Maybe trying to traverse as much of that scale as you can over time, back and forth, is a healthy thing to do. Everything in moderation. It's very Quakerly.
I think that my thoughts on it are that there's limited, the space is like becoming more, space is definitely a commodity, like you mentioned earlier, like health, space, time, they're all like definitely a luxury, and even like reflection on those things is luxury. And like this, like these 2 hours, like with everyone on a stage, talking, and trying to like extend that conversation is a challenge. And having spaces, this is what I loved is you guys, the chapter when you recorded a hike, and one of the excerpts from that, one of you says, and that's why we need more spaces for challenging conversations to unfold, more unexpected gatherings, more engagement, and communities. So, Una, to answer your question, I think that fitting in our little small gatherings in a larger scale, we can like make them interconnect and be reflective and thoughtful on how we're affecting each other and other things, and without being like totally ignorant of it. But it's not like the train is leaving the tracks. But it's mostly like making sure that those spaces are open to thinking about those things, and whether like you can't close them off, and whether they're the classroom or you and a friend hiking, or a workplace, if you're having trying to answer larger questions, this isn't like a rally for free speech or anything. I'm just trying to say that like if you're just trying to like answer questions and like have these kind of conversations, and you're not able to, those spaces aren't productive And that's it.
She is going to tell us the answer. No, he is. Okay.
Well, I think you kind of said when you were discussing scale earlier that not only can't you separate yourself from both this like oneness and like you can't separate the individual from the whole, I don't think. And you were talking about this in terms of scale, and I think the fact that it is on a scale itself is a whole, and like by being a small part or a large part, it's still a part. And I don't know, I think that you must reconcile the things. I don't know.
No, you changed your mind.
Something that I've noticed is that my interactions with nature are usually like in parks or on campus or like pets, and it's very rare that I am in nature that is actually like not human made. Like when you're walking down the street and you see a tree, you're like, whoa, it's a tree, it's nature, but like that tree was placed there by a person, and like a park was planned out and placed. And even with pets, like they were domesticated and are kind of living within our boundaries. So I was just wondering, sometimes I think about it and I'm like, is that necessarily even like still nature? And like, how do you guys feel about, I mean, it's already kind of gotten to that point where like our interactions with nature and the nature that exists and like probably pretty soon will only exist will be nature that is planned and placed by us or domesticated by us. And like, how is that going to change how we view nature, and like also just how we view how things work? Because it's like we're going to view everything as being something that we can place and create and control. I don't know. Yeah.
I think, Nate, the idea of human civilization versus nature is a false dichotomy. Really, we're just talking about self and other, in a sense, because even if you could imagine going to a great wilderness area, for example, I have had the privilege of having 5 field seasons in central Siberia and being hundreds and hundreds of kilometers away from any other human being or anything that human ever built. But the thing is that everything around me was already mediated by the activity of humans on the planet. You know, I could see the permafrost melting. I could see things that wouldn't be happening if it were not for humans. So I think there's just a giant gradient.
Yeah, and it is worth thinking about when we invest in nature as being this thing that's completely separate from humans. Well, what work does that do for us? What damage has that caused? If we think, for example, the way to preserve nature is to lock it up in a wildlands park, well, who pays the price for that? And many of our national parks were created by making leave some of the people that live there. So often indigenous cultures that have been there for a long time. Did they live in a non-natural place? Does nature mean no humans can be in there? And one other thing that I think it's taken us a long time to learn and relearn is that very often what strikes us as being a natural expanse is actually a managed expanse. We just didn't see that management at work by indigenous cultures.
It's a great question.
It reminds me too of the student who emailed you earlier and said, "Dear Professor Elkins-Tanton, I will take to terraform Mars." Yeah. 3 to 5 years, like as if you can just bracket it and figure it out. But sort of the mistake there is thinking that anything can be sort of isolated from these much more complex, longer processes that.
Yeah, I get these emails from middle schoolers or high schoolers who are writing reports, and they need to do a little interview with the professor. And so the one I got was, how many years of terraforming Mars would it take before we could just walk around free? And I was saying how discouraging it was to me, because to write back honestly, I have to say, look, we do not know the first thing about terraforming. We don't understand the climate on the Earth. We do not know how to do this. This is not a thing. But Chris and Jeffrey were like, but that would be so depressing. Just say 3 to 5 years.
Wouldn't it be the worst, the little middle schooler? This is not a thing?
I know.
Okay, Maggie's going to wrap it up here.
All right.
Sorry, Maggie's.
No, not my chance.
So this, I think, is a fun but a related question. So there's this podcast by Gimlet, one of my favorite media outlets, called Habitat. And I'm not sure if you've heard of this project, but they've built, the podcast just consists of audio recordings, because I guess they can't have video, or I'm not sure, but
Yeah.
I meant video
that
at
was
the
not
site.
helpful.
But
Sorry.
anyway, it's on a volcano in Hawaii, and they've built like you've heard of this. Yeah. Well, do you want to talk on it? Okay.
No, I don't.
Well, so my question is,
Supporting you. Keep going.
okay, honestly, well, my question was going to be what you thought of the project, because it seems, one, it's assuming we're going to habitate Mars, because, well, I should explain it to the audience. The project is a structure, a dome, on a volcano or a lava flow on Mars, or on in Hawaii, and these NASA recruits have to live there for a year.
Something I forget. Yeah.
For a year. 3 to 5 years for a year, and they're basically just like doing a trial of, and they have to pretend like the air is poisonous, so they can only go outside if they're in spacesuits, and basically trial run what it would be like to live on Mars, in the dome, and so that's my question. What do you think of this project?
Okay, that is a thing. That thing is a thing.
Yeah, it is a thing.
Because I really do think we are going to Mars. We're definitely going to the moon. I'm pretty darn sure we're going to the Mars. Elon Musk is going to do it, or Virgin Galactic is going to do it, or Blue Origins is going to do it. Like, people with enough money are going to do this, but they're not going to terraform Mars. They're going to make a little tiny bubble, and everyone's going to live in there, and then they're going to come back, or they're going to die. Seriously. That's basically what we're talking about, right? We're going to try to figure out how to have a settlement up there, and it's so different from trying to terraform, but you have to kind of practice that, and a lot of it is around psychology and group dynamics. It's how do we survive? And I know an astronaut who spent a lot of time on the space station, and she said that a lot of these plans are around having 4 or 5 people when we're talking about going to the moon or something like that. But she said it has to be more than 6. You have to have at least 6 people so that whatever the dynamics are in the group, there's somebody you want to hang out with. So that's the kind of thing we're figuring out.
If I may just point that towards something that I've been thinking about, it seems to me that every time we try to figure it out, we replicate a Noah's Ark logic, where we imagine that there's some kind of bubble or, it's always a survival pod, a bubble, some way for community to sail into the future and bring their environment with them, without usually thinking through at what cost, who's excluded, what's it like to actually live in there, what kind of hell might it have been on Noah's Ark as the manure starts to pile up and the seas are churning? Yeah, these are questions that we've been asking for a long time, but we tend to keep putting them in forms that are not new but seem completely novel.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks.